Does anyone have any other thoughts on whether the big unsolved problems?
Well, I think a generalization of the CO2 problem is our thirst for energy and our traditional sources of energy, which is probably the cause of most of the anthropogenic CO2. So I'd broaden it out actually to solving the energy problem, or because we're not going to give up our thirst for energy.
Yeah. And I wonder whether, when, just taking that argument, the next step is, you ask, well, what are you using energy for? So, if you had to put them in two broad categories of industrial versus domestic consumption, and it's almost a no-brainer that the, high percentage of energy that we're putting into industrial, production of goods that we all demand. So should we be starting to look at the combination of, the products, the energy, the processes, and really start to bring them all together so that you're creating solutions that don't just sort of isolate these into these separate dimensions and go, right, I'm going to achieve energy efficiency here, and then I'm going to worry about the quality of the product there, and then I'm going to worry about my process here. So in fact, in some of the work that we do in working with manufacturers who are indeed, large guzzlers of energy is, how do you achieve all of the above? Because at the end of the day, you still have to make the product. So whether we're talking about making a ceramic product or whether we're talking about saving on energy. So an interesting example of what we're doing, for instance, in our Green Hub, is making the argument to a specialty metals producer that by introducing a novel ceramic layer on top of that metal, you're actually going to, in the long term, when your customers use your product, save on energy. So we're actually starting to think about that vertical integration in the space of energy, if I can call it that way. So we're not just saying that, the supplier is just providing a metallic product and selling it to the customer, but rather providing a vertically well thought out product that actually saves the user a lot of energy. So it's interesting that, we've started to think about it in the context of not just what, our producer, our collaborators making in terms of this metal product, but rather the innovation around creating this new ceramic layer on the surface allows our producer to then go back and work with their customers and say, this is how our product is superior because it saves you energy. So it's an interesting sort of question on, can we start to take on a whole lot more because we recognize everybody wants to save on energy. So it's interesting in terms of how we actually pose our questions and we take responsibility of the full value chain, if you wish, in terms of us taking responsibility all the way down to the user who might actually save on energy requirements even well beyond our own factory floor, if you wish. And there's where the value is, both to, from an economic sense, but also from that energy and environmental sense. So different way of thinking.
Peter, I might ask you, do you think making more inorganic materials and more energy efficient is maybe one of the big challenges in that?
Well, I was just going to say that I don't think there's any doubt that the energy problem in the world is something that many people will be working towards and trying to solve. I think one of the major things holding it back, though, is when chemistry becomes involved with politics again, and whether the politics will allow those energy problems to be solved and bring in the coal problem. And I don't want to be controversial, but the coal industry must be our NRA in Australia. They really hold the government to ransom in many ways, I think. So the coal industry is here to stay, and they really work on that. And it becomes a big political problem.
Andrew, you have a comment on that? Maybe?
Only to say that I think it does bring us back to this problem that this issue that we as physical scientists and biological scientists actually need to embrace the social sciences now and the humanities in the way we address a lot of things, and a lot of those problems will have that dimension which we're not, I think most of us aren't used to thinking about. And,
I think that's a good point, that that working in tandem with some of the other areas rather than being alone can help to solve these problems. They're becoming more interdisciplinary than just a chemical problem.
I might segue then to Justin, because I know you work in the field of nanomedicine, and there's a parallel discussions there about precision or personalized medicine and the social dimensions of that. On one hand, it's an interesting scientific challenge, but although on the other hand, we might be going too far towards serving just the elite. Have you any? So is precision medicine one of the big problems, or we should focus on?
Well, yeah, I mean, so we actually in the Centre of Excellence and in the Australian Centre of Nanomedicine have the same social scientist who actually addresses some of these issues. And actually it is pretty interesting because, you know, if you listen to some of, say, the anti-nano debate that went on a few years ago, it was very much about people, you know, the rhetoric that I was hearing amongst colleagues was very much about people's fear of the unknown, it was about persistent nanoparticles, really the fear of that. And when you talk to the social scientist, he says, no, it's not that at all, actually, because when they actually look at, you know, go out and do talking to people and doing the social science in the way they do it, which I don't fully comprehend, but with their surveys, you know, he worked on the GMO debate in the UK and then the nano debate in the UK. He said it's a lot more about people feeling the loss of control, and the fear is the loss of control. And he also talked to us a little bit about this precision medicine movement by Obama, and he says that the websites, the language used in the websites, you know, in the stuff put out by the, you know, that precision medicine movement is very careful to try and make it clear that it's not just about the elite. That's what they're trying to do, because the perception, of course, is about the elite. But, you know, is it about the elite? Well, healthcare is often about the elite. You know, there's a clear correlation with the amount of money spent on healthcare, apart from the US, and life expectancy too. So,
George, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, the question I would raise is, when one thinks about medicine, the notion usually devolves around the health of an individual, but we live in a resource-limited world in which everything is allocation. And are you better off thinking about how to put together a public health policy which enables more people to live longer in good health? Or are you better off keeping, how do I put this politely, people like me staggering along at great expense for some period of time? And I don't ask you for a show of hands on this because I'm polite, but I do think it is a problem. Precision medicine to me is something which falls in the category of end-of-life, symptomatic, and expensive, and I personally like throughout life, but particularly at the beginning of life, an inexpensive and broad population, but they're different philosophies. However, both of them are loaded with really interesting problems.
yeah, can I make another comment? So obviously after 9/11, there was an awful lot of money put into diagnostic devices to detect early warning systems, you know, technologies to try and look at whether, you know, airborne biowarfare agents were going through into the buildings. And the end result was perhaps that we end up with the same technologies we had before. There's a very interesting paper in PNAS that I read at the time because I was asked to write something on this field. And it actually pertains to what George is sort of talking about. And it wasn't a technology, it wasn't an experimental paper, it was a theoretical paper. And how would you what was the best way of dealing with a biowarfare attack? And the answer was arming, according to this paper, basically stocking up vaccines in hospitals and having everything closely, you know, so that people didn't have to go too far. So that's a little bit like the same sort of answer. It's how do you know, is the money going into the diagnostic devices to make people feel comfortable to some degree, not necessarily solve the problem.